Okay, here we go. Welcome, everybody, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you, depending on where you are in the world. I can see from the very active chat on the left-hand side of the screen here that we have a lot of people joining from really a wide range of locations and professional affiliations, which is wonderful to see. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ann Lang. I'm the Executive Director of the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection, that's PHAP for short, and I am very pleased to be serving as host and moderator for today's event. Now I see very many familiar faces, many members of the association, as well as special guests in the virtual audience today. So I'll keep my introductory remarks very brief. I'd just like to say a few words about the context of today's event. As many of you know, this is part of a long series of live online discussion and consultation events that PHAP has been organizing in support of the World Humanitarian Summit consultation process. This particular event today, focusing on faith and religion in humanitarian action, was inspired by a recent symposium, a major symposium here in Geneva entitled Religions Together for Humanitarian Action, which took place on the 27th of May, just a couple of weeks ago, and was hosted by the Order of Malta here in Geneva. It consisted of two high-level panel discussions, one looking at present challenges for faith-based institutions, and a second high-level panel discussion entitled Preparing for the Future, How Can Faith-Based Institutions Better Assist and Protect Civilian Populations in Times of Conflict? So today's consultation event picks up on a number of the important themes that were highlighted throughout that symposium and takes them forward initially with a presentation, a guest presentation, which I'll introduce in a moment, and then by a combined panel discussion and participants consultation. So just to explain a bit more the structure of today's event, because it's a bit different from some others that I think many of you have participated in. There will be two distinct components to the event today. The first part, as I said, will be a presentation of approximately 20 minutes in duration. This will be a presentation by guest expert Alistair Ager, and I'll introduce Alistair in more detail in just a moment. An important note regarding the presentation component. This is actually, in addition to supporting our discussion today, this presentation forms a part of our learning series, continuous learning series hosted by PHAP, and will therefore include an optional assessment component to verify or check knowledge gained. And that's an optional assessment that's available to those of you who are PHAP members who are participating in the continuous learning credits program. And if you're interested in participating in that way, if you're a member of the association, please take note of the assessment code, a 4-digit code that will appear on your screen at the end of the presentation. Then following the presentation, we'll have a brief Q&A. And then we will move into a panel discussion and active participant consultation with several guest panelists and with frequent poll questions so that we can really engage in a back and forth active discussion with all of you who are joining us today. And I'll introduce our panelists following the presentation component. So now, taking care of just a few quick housekeeping matters, I wanted to point out for those of you who are new to the platform, the Ask a Question feature. So this is complementary to, separate from the chat, which I can see everybody is actively using, which is fantastic. If you have a question at any point during the event, and we encourage questions at any time, please submit it through the Ask a Question box, which you'll find in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. It will then come to us here in the tech room where we can organize the questions that come in and then put them forward in the Q&A. So please do put forward any and all questions that you may have in the question box. Secondly, and very importantly for today, I would like to point out the poll question feature. My colleague Marcus is putting a new one up on the screen here as an example. This is, as I've said, a consultation event. We'll be very much counting on all of the participants in the virtual room to provide their input on all of the questions that arise throughout the discussion. And our means of doing that will be primarily through these instant polls. So we're running through an example here. I can see that actually for the majority of people in the room, it looks like this is your first time on this platform. So warm welcome to you who are first timers with us today. So do keep an eye on your screen as the panelists are speaking to see the new poll questions coming up. And because we have a lot of questions that we anticipate arising today, do answer the poll quickly, because the poll will only be available for a couple of minutes and then it will be replaced by another one. So please do take just a few seconds to answer the polls when they arise. Next, just a couple of additional technical points. Throughout the event, there will be a live Twitter feed for those of you who are Twitter users. You can follow at PHAP Forum and use the hashtag ReshapeAid, which is the hashtag for the World Humanitarian Summit process. And then finally, in case any of you are experiencing technical problems, connection problems with the Adobe platform that we're using for the interactive event, I would like to point out that we have a backup option. You can watch the event live streamed via YouTube at the URL that you see in front of you on the screen. But do note that if you opt to use the backup option, that will be just a live stream. It will be just a passive viewing experience, and unfortunately will not include any of the interactive features such as the chat and the poll. So if you're able to stay in the interactive platform, we certainly encourage you.
You have been muted.
Okay, now moving on to, as I said, the first component of our event today, I would like to give a very warm welcome to our guest expert speaker, Alistair Ager. Alistair is a professor of clinical population and family health at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. He has worked in the field of international development with a focus on refugees and internally displaced communities for 25 years after originally training in psychology. He is the author of over 100 scholarly publications, including, particularly relevant for us today, the forthcoming book entitled Faith, Secularism, and Humanitarian Engagement. So we're very pleased to have Alistair with us today, and I'm afraid I've taken a bit more time than I had planned for my introduction. But Alistair, please do feel free to take your full 20 minutes, because I know that you have a lot of very valuable content to share with us today, and I will give you the floor, Alistair.
Thanks very much, Anne Harrod, and welcome to everyone. And it is a great opportunity to just share some reflections at the beginning of this session to stimulate some debate online and subsequently amongst the panel. I want to begin with a personal reflection of something around 10 years ago. I'm just going to go on to this slide here, which is in Darfur, and I was working for a short while supporting an assessment for UNICEF of the situation analysis for children during the conflict there. And some of these images reflect the humanitarian engagement that I was involved in, working to keep children's activities. But I particularly want to draw attention to the picture in the bottom right-hand corner, which was a meeting with sheikhs and umars that was arranged during my visit. And I want to just share a little reflection on that, of these sheikhs and umars packed into the tent meeting represented our commitment to engaging with religious leaders on the question of the threats to the well-being of children in the camp in Al-Fasher and appropriate means to ensure their protection. With consistency, our goal, we ran through the framing questions that we had used in previous meetings with other stakeholders. We were received respectfully and patiently, and the usual list of concerns about food and shelter and health and education emerged. It had been a useful confirmatory meeting. It was nearly done, but my brief speech offering thanks for their time and insight prompted an unanticipated diversion from the planned agenda. A speaker at the back rose to his feet and began with echoing thanks. However, before the interpreter had put this into words for me, I could sense a shift in tone and intensity. Murmurs and gestures signaled that the assembly was swiftly aligning itself with this man's sentiments. The translation remained a sentence or two behind the surging narrative, but it was clear that while my concern for children was appreciated, the Western lens through which I viewed childhood was not. I had introduced a Hawaja curriculum for children in activity centres. I had not valued the duties of children expected within Islam. I had not facilitated securing copies of the Quran to enable the proper upbringing of children. There was more animation in the meeting on this topic than any other, but insecure on this theme, I redoubled my attempts at thanks and closed the discussion. I tried to explain that I was not responsible for the activity centres myself. I stated that I didn't represent any one humanitarian agency, but was rather working to highlight the needs of communities in Darfur for humanitarian agencies. But even as I spoke, this seemed a rather facile distinction. I was, after all, part of the humanitarian enterprise, and it was an enterprise that provided no space for discussion of faith and religion. This was seen as dangerous territory in Darfur, or indeed anywhere. The irony was that as a person of faith, I had accepted this position so readily and uncritically. The discussion with the Sheikhs and Umars was duly recorded, but did not significantly influence the formulation of our situation analysis, which saw religious concerns coded within a broader context of respect for traditional culture. Now, I share that story, and I'm sure many people on the call have many similar experiences where the framework that we're using, the approach, the agenda that we have for humanitarianism butts up against some realities. And that was a reality that we had tended to marginalize discussion and engagement with religious actors. They were on my agenda, they were on my script to meet them, but I wasn't really prepared to meet them on their terms or with respect to their agenda, and I was uncomfortable as a result of that meeting. Particularly uncomfortable if I go to the next slide, when I was reviewing not long after that the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is central to much of the work that I do, and I just saw Article 14 in this new light of how I had ignored that or not really been respectful of that in terms of not only indeed the expectations of freedom of thought, conscience and religion for children, but actually respecting and supporting parents in their rights and duties with respect to supporting children in their exercise of religious freedom and religious development. So I just wanted to use that as one incident that has prompted me to say, why does this happen? Or is this a common occurrence in humanitarian work? How do we really understand religion? What are the basis for our seeking to engage or not to engage with religion? And I now want to the next 7 or 8 minutes just take you through a little bit of the analysis that I've done subsequently, which has helped me come up with some of the framings and the questions to help us guide how to work more effectively in this area. So, a little bit of history. At one level, it makes absolutely no sense to talk of new approaches or a new engagement with religion, because for most people it's recognized that the very notion of humanitarianism is deeply imbued with religious traditions and reflects religious sentiments. And the first quote on this slide comes from Jean Pictet, a moral philosopher heavily influencing understanding of humanitarianism within the International Red Cross movement, and seeing that the fundamental precepts of humanity in this whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do you even to them, is a precept within a number of great religious traditions, and so that humanitarian concerns are being presented and are understood often to be very much coherent with humanitarian sentiment. And I want to draw your attention to the quotations also from Henri Dunant, the founder of the Red Cross movement, the reflections in his work on the reflections on the Battle of Solferino. And there's something about this language that I think is something that we don't often see today. So Observing the battle, Dunant observed, why could not advantage be taken of a time of relative calm and quiet to investigate and try to solve a question of such immense and worldwide importance, which was caring for the physical needs of the combating soldiers, both from the humane and the Christian standpoint. Dunant is saying, whether we're religious or whether we're not religious, we can use precepts to begin to understand the situation. And he's happy to refer and call upon religious sentiments as well as humanitarian, humane ones. And he's happy also in the justification for this to recount the work of a countess who was scolding an Italian physician who was providing preferential care for combatants on his side. And he quotes in support of his notion of humanitarianism her attestation of commitment from religion, from a religious basis, as he sees that the doctor is preferring to support the Allies rather than the Austrians in this conflict. She says she made no difference between friends and enemies, for our Lord Jesus Christ made no such distinctions between men in well-doing. So all I'm saying here is that in the foundation and the understanding of humanitarianism, religious precepts, Christian, Muslim and otherwise, have generally been seen to be coherent with that, and in previous times something we could freely draw upon. Clearly, I think as we go through the 20th century, I want to argue that the situation has changed. And so we were in a situation recently, I think we see another change now, where we've become more uncomfortable in discussing and engaging with religious actors and religion itself within the context of humanitarianism. And I want to suggest that there are three particular trends over that period of time that we could note as being important. One is professionalization. As humanitarianism was professionalized, and many of us work towards that and welcome that, there's become a codification of a professional language, a technical language. Increasingly, agencies are not just doing work provided by their own supporters of faith groups or not faith groups, but rather working for government and contracting for UN agencies. There's a technical formality of the nature of that working. And in Barnett and Stein's study, the one that's highlighted on this slide of looking at faith-based organizations and secular organizations, frankly concluded that if you actually looked at the work that was done and the language that was used about the work that was done, it was very difficult to distinguish between faith-based organizations and secular agencies. And a most recent trend I think is interesting with respect to this, where rather than faith-based organizations, a number of groups have preferred to refer to themselves as faith-inspired. So the faith is seen to be something which prompts action, but once that action is initiated, we wouldn't expect to see anything different regarding faith-based actors and secular actors. It's a professional field, and we do this profession similarly, no matter what our faith tradition. Globalization has clearly also significantly changed our understanding of how we might relate to religion because of the diversity of situations in which we are working. Again, the establishment of a global humanitarian regime with a shared language, and that language has generally been seen to be appropriately secular. I've highlighted the change in logos for Child Fund, which used to be known as Christian Children's Fund, had a very much a tradition with support from the Southern Church within the US. But Child Fund operating in Afghanistan, for example, clearly felt it was inappropriate to be labelled and to be seen as the Christian Children's Fund working in that context. And partly for security, but also for degree of sensitivity, branded themselves in that context as Child Fund, and subsequently saw it as more appropriate to promote their work, to rebrand and to reformulate very much more as a secular organization. So globalization also encouraged this trend for rethinking our relationship between humanitarianism and religion. And then thirdly, secularization itself. Within much of the world, the 20th century was marked by significant change. Look at the second point first, a reduction in religious belief and public practice. And there was this notion of what was called the secularization thesis, which was that with development, most parts of the world would experience a significant decrease in religious affiliation, religious attendance, and that was part of modernization. Religion should be respected, but largely it was likely to decline through the course of the 20th and into the 21st centuries. And we'll note that that has clearly not been seen as a valid course of events. Secularization can also be seen not just though as the amount of religious belief within a society or practice, but the way that we organize a diversity of religious practice within a state. And secularization is also another form of the word. I'm drawing on the work of Charles Taylor, is to see that we allow individuals to have individual religious beliefs, but largely these are kept in private spaces, and in public spaces we're not expected that religious language to be used. So the norms and principles that we operate with, whether they're economic, political, educational, professional, generally involve us a language, whether we're people of faith or not, to not refer to our faith in those public spaces. So those are three general influences, I think, that completes a little history that influenced the understanding of engagement with religion within humanitarian space. And then in my remaining time, I just want to point to more recent reappraisals, and I want to use 3 or 4 slides to do that. First of all, that understanding, and I hinted it on the previous slide, of a reappraisal of the notion of secularization, that really religion should be respected, but was not really a powerful force in the public sphere and would be a declining force. Much academic research and many political philosophers have come to considerably rethink that phenomenon in the late 20th and early 21st century. And Jürgen Habermas, a major public philosopher who was a contributor to one of the books on the right-hand side of the screen there, has really rethought an understanding of the power of religion to shape public understandings. And these 3 books I put there are just an example of the broader stock-taking, if you like, of the place of religion. So humanitarianism and development world is not alone in rethinking its relationship with religion. Significantly amongst that have been a number of humanitarian actors that have begun to rethink relationships, and the one I particularly want to draw attention to, it's by no means the only one, is UNHCR itself, with the High Commissioner's Dialogue on Faith and Protection, a yearly event in 2012 being focused explicitly on the issue of engaging of protection and religion and faith and protection. And the High Commissioner has this quote that began to say, well, look, yes, of course, the UNHCR is a secular organization, but let's be careful what we understand by that. That does not mean to be a secular organization is not to acknowledge the religious experience of refugees, and indeed the importance of that religious experience in different traditions for refugees. And we must not discriminate amongst people based on their religion. There's a sensitivity, but to ignore faith would be to ignore its potential for preserving dignity and for finding solutions for the people we care for. And UNHCR, I deeply respect the work subsequent to that dialogue, which has been looking at how UNHCR can not only be more faith literate, one of the objectives subsequently, but also more generally understanding the role of religion in supporting communities and individuals who are displaced, and the general role of faith engagement in humanitarian assistance. The next issue, in terms of appraisal, I want to draw attention to significant research that's now being conducted in this area, and Mark has put some of the references that I think are particularly helpful there. I just want to mention 3 bits of work and 3 findings, or 3 things that I think we could say are emerging from this field. There's a paper there from the Joint Learning Initiative on faith and local communities. You can hopefully see it clearly enough to see the number of agencies, again, faith-based and secular organizations interested in better tracking the role of religion, particularly at the local level in terms of supporting humanitarian response. Forced Migration Online had this, and the Forced Migration Review had this major supplement earlier this year on the role of faith in responses to displacement, which elicited a very extensive amount of good practice within the NGO sector, and also some challenges that face by the sector. And in the bottom right-hand corner, just an example of a piece of work that we've recently completed looking at local faith engagement in Irbid in Jordan, and looking at the role of multiple faith communities in supporting Syrian refugees. And in this reappraisal, I want to just suggest that there are three challenges with the previous framing, with the business as usual approach that had developed in our understanding of religion, and that really reflected my ignorance 10 years ago in Darfur. One is the notion that the framing that we've had up till now has tended to privatize religious belief. It's not to deny it, to say it's there, it's very important, but you keep that to yourself. You keep that to within your own council, within your own family, but don't bring it into public language. We're not comfortable with that religious language in the public sphere. And one of the dangers of that privatization of religion is it tends to reinforce a rather Western splitting of religion from the other parts of people's life, as if we can split ourselves in that way. I've seen many examples. The Middle East would be a very good example, where local organizations found it really very difficult in their understanding of their faith and their obligations to create that split between a personal piety and a public practice, which was being demanded or expected to somehow create this division within religion of personal religious belief and public action. So the whole notion of keeping it to yourself, although for understandable reasons in terms of minimizing conflict, potentially reduces the power of religion. Marginalization was very much what happened in that context in Darfur, that it was not on the agenda, it was pushed to the agenda. I had meet with religious leaders as part of my agenda, but it was not a serious part of the analysis and the engagement. I have a recent example of that is, I think, very powerful also from our work in Irbid, where there was a very successful livelihoods program led by a local CBO, which had a faith affiliation. And in the reports of the effectiveness of that livelihood program for young girls, I saw no mention of religion. When I spoke with the staff there, originally there was no mention of religion. And when we asked how it was that the program was successful, only then did we get to understand that the mobilization of young girls, the reassurance of their parents that these girls would be well cared for, was heavily dependent upon the respect and the piety of the women that were running this program, that their religious credibility, the trust that they'd established was absolutely key. But because it was a religious phenomenon, it was not reported on, it was marginalized. And finally, Duncan Green, working with a secular organization and from very much a secular mindset, has recently published a wonderful illustrative YouTube video about this third phenomenon of instrumentalization, which is saying, basically taking what religion produces or facilitates to be useful to the broader agenda, but utilizing it for some other agenda and not really seeing it holistically in its own terms. And Duncan Green describes working post-tsunami in Aceh, and working with a community and supporting in the typical Oxfam model the way of promoting local agendas and what was their appropriate response for resilience and building back, and the community came back and prioritized the reconstruction of the mosque as their top priority. And Duncan notes very honestly how Oxfam found that very difficult. How could it support the rebuilding of a mosque? Wasn't that in violation of humanitarian principles to be supporting a religious activity of that sort? But eventually it was found possible to support that as long as the mosque was referred to in all technical documents as a community centre. And so if a mosque is seen as a community centre reflecting a secular agenda, it's okay. If a mosque is fully seen for what it is for the local population, it becomes something uncomfortable for humanitarian engagement. Okay, I want to draw to a close. My time is nearly up, but I just want to share 4 reflections of issues that I think are likely to come up in our discussion and are likely to come up in the forum, and to help build a little bit on the previous analysis as we're coming out of the history of the way we have typically framed these things, and particularly in the light of the World Humanitarian Summit, how we want to reframe things more freshly, particularly if there's a common theme is to strengthen the engagement of local actors, as one Oxfam publication calls turning the system on its head, not having it run from Geneva or New York, but having it very much understood in terms of local response that is facilitated by international actors. So if we're going to really strengthen the role of local actors and our understanding of engagement with local communities that are many frequently, significantly connected with faith traditions, and local CBOs, which are community-based organisations which have a strong religious affiliation in many, many contexts, is very important. So the four issues I anticipate we'll be talking about. Number one is the resources and capacities of local faith communities relevant to humanitarian response and means of accessing them. Our Joint Learning Initiative work and the publications I showed earlier on has shown it through various frameworks, whether we use it in terms of material capital and social capital, indeed in spiritual capital. There are many things that local organisations, faith communities provide that are very relevant to humanitarian response. And so commonly our story will be, we need to recognise that better and we need to somehow connect with it more effectively. And I welcome that discussion. The second point remains a caution from that previous era of, particularly in terms of the threat of diversity relating to conflict and potentially assumptions regarding partiality of humanitarian provision on the basis of different faith traditions, that we need to be mindful of the risks of engaging with the religious communities and how do we moderate those risks so we've seen that we are fully serving humanity in an appropriately balanced way. And those are not competing discourses, those 2 points, but they tend to be the sort of the good news and the bad news. There's lots of assets here that we need to be careful. There are two other points that I would encourage us, in the light of the World Humanitarian Summit, wanting us to have a broader framing to engage with. The third is the reframing of humanitarianism if viewed from a religious perspective, not being instrumental in what can humanitarians get from religion, but rather saying, given the traditions and the influences upon our understandings of humanitarianism, what is it at a local level and at a global level that in rethinking humanitarianism, as we are called to do in terms of this World Humanitarian Summit, what can we draw that is fresh and new and challenging from a religious perspective? Not a shopping list that helps us modify our current models, but one that radically challenges them. And the fourth one is that to do that properly revolves dialogue. And I really welcome, thank you Marcus and colleagues at PHAP and others, to enable this sort of dialogue we'll have today. And I think it's great seeing at the UNHCR a dialogue now, this discussion, many other discussions and agencies, the Order of Malta convened meeting last week, are really welcome in terms of a global dialogue. And I've called it a dialogue of diversity. We're not just trying to seek common language, we're trying to celebrate our diversity in different traditions and find ways of working together. The real challenge for me is enabling that at the local level in terms of humanitarian response. So these dialogues happen within and across communities, and I know that's going to be a major challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. And we do have a number of questions that have come in. We have limited time, but I think we will try to take up one of these questions at least here. So we have a question for you from Jakub, who's based in the Czech Republic and joining from there today. Jakub writes, there is an extensive amount of research on the correlations between religion and spirituality on the one hand and physical and mental health on the other hand that is now available in general. But he's asking, is there something comparable specifically in the area of humanitarian action that you're aware of that you could recommend as further reading or a resource?
No, it's a great question, and I would refer him to the book I mentioned, the Sacred Aid book by Michael Barnett and Gross Stein. There's a chapter about by Peter Walker and colleagues. Peter Walker recently left the Feinstein Institute, very much Oxfam tradition, a secularist, but he also draws attention to that literature and says that in terms of understanding resilience and community coping at the individual, family and community level, he's really persuaded by that significance of the literature regarding faith affiliation and community engagement, and calling for more research to look at that in context of humanitarian work. And the joint learning report that also is there and is flagged as reading reviews some of that early material, but I think it's much stronger case outside of humanitarian context. But I think plausibly, and I think in many people's experience, if we look at the narratives of refugees, they often call upon see their faith affiliation, their religion as a bedrock that was with them at the darkest and most difficult times. And so I think it's absolutely right that connecting with that is a key element of understanding what supporting resilience might be.
Great, thank you very much. So now I'll just pause briefly. So again, as mentioned at the beginning, for those of you who are members of the association and would like to take the optional assessments following the presentation by Alistair, please note the assessment code which you will need to access the assessment is 8268, as you see on the screen there. And there will also be a follow-up email with instructions for those of you members who are interested in following that. Great, so thanks again to Alistair. We're going to move now to the second portion of our event, which is